I don't know if anyone has ever been curious. World's top university. So much for critical thinking. They even regarded him as standard for measuring academic ability. Many people may not know. Even if you graduated from Peking University's top strata student to critical thinking, you're still going to get low grades. Even many people originally had excellent grades. Harvard and seeing these names. From strata student to scum in an instant. The reason behind this is precisely the understanding and mastery of critical thinking. Critical thinking. What is the European and American education system that is delivered? Or is he really capable of shaping? What about a person's ability to think independently? Today, let's talk about critical thinking. Hello, I am Plato Stone. In order to facilitate, before we start, I will briefly introduce the content structure of and the main reason for creating this video. Audiences with a deep understanding of critical thinking. So customize your preferences. Jump to the corresponding section. In the first, and I'm going to go through this very quickly. History of CTRL thinking. Certainly, history is not pedagogical. It's about the clinical, the whole thinking philosophical background. And I noticed that is found in many related. There is no comprehensive and systematic introduction, so that many people embrace critical. They all seem very impulsive. It seems to be to sell books, and in the past 2 years, the concept has suddenly started to be hyped. A lot of interesting context to this. Part 2. It's me in most videos. Etymology traceability. That is, from the change of language and clarify the concept of clinical thinking itself. By the way, find out through the language, cultural context behind this and his place in the entire Western context. The third part is the dissection of the concept. I will use the text and information I have at my disposal of critical thinking, including from the perspective of different translation and new translation term. Part 4. It's about critical thinking, the miraculous translation itself, popular science, who translated, and why did he translate it this way? Concept. How did you enter Asia and China? Part the 5th. It is aimed at Japan, the center of Western learning, and let me give you a brief introduction. Current translation standards of China and the misreading and reconstruction of Western learning as the so-called autumn of a leaf. Chinese published. In fact, there are many inappropriate translations necessary for us to understand. And how did Japan reinvent these concepts? Real reason. Very interesting. Part the 6th. It's a structure about the skin shape thinking itself. I am personally critical. Some knowledge and understanding of thinking. Maybe after reading it, you can further learn systematically, offer a deeper motivation. Finally, I would like to clarify with the audience the reason why I made this video. In fact, regular viewers should have noticed. I made the video for a long time, mainly because I have been reading and traveling for a while. Knowledge blogger. You also need, after all, I don't have a team either. Copy for certainly. The main reason why I made this video. Yes, I recently received one commission for foreign book. The content of this book, critical, a thinking system textbook. I won't reveal too much based on the contract requirements. I actually ran into a lot of problems. Are due to cultural differences. At first I thought, appropriate righteous assistance or gain, and solve these problems perfectly. But then I found out, the real problem is not the translation itself. It's outside the books. So I am very urgent. I want to share some of my knowledge, share with everyone. Hope to be able to communicate with, offer some help. Okay, so let's take a look first of critical thinking. Critical thinking as a educational evaluation criteria. European and American society. But strictly speaking, flat panel thinking is not a modern phenomenon. When we trace its origin, we can find tablet thinking runs through almost the entire philosophy. Its roots can be traced back to ancient Greece. For example, the method of questioning emphasized is by asking consecutive questions, expose irrationalities in the hypothesis, identify the contradictions step by step, push thinking to a deeper level. Baratu was also idealistic. Fifth volume of The Country clearly states the difference between opinion and true knowledge. Beta believes that people get opinions through their senses is unreliable. True knowledge, it must be obtained through reason and logic. This knowledge is true. Eternal. This distinction established the core idea of Western philosophical. It's also skin-shaped thinking. It's a foundation for logical and rational, and not roughing the student. Aristotle created a formal logic system, a syllogism is proposed. Stressed that reasoning must follow a logical form. This directly established the whole logic, the theoretical foundation of critical thinking. The Middle Ages in Europe. The philosophical background of critical thinking. But through rigorous logical training in empirical philosophy, dialectical method, it has been further deepened and developed. Many outdated views of history highlight the importance of the modern Enlightenment. Habit will be medieval, depicted as a dark age. But the philosophers of the time took it very seriously. This logical system. This is instrumental theory. Apply it widely to philosophy, theology, and education. In the field of education, medieval model of university, such as the University of Paris, founded in the early 12th century, in the late 12th century, they all put a lot of emphasis on dialectical lecturing and open debate. Free translation and grammar in university courses at that time. Logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy. The first three translations, inextricably linked to instrumental theory. In the fields of philosophy and theology, so see many applications of logical reasoning. For example, the representative works, Encyclopedia of Theology. C. It uses a clear and well-defined logical argument structure, including Apollard's masterpieces Yes and also collected many, the views of church authorities. In terms of pros and cons, expose its contradictions through logical, clarify the truth. And at the end of the Middle Ages, Europe entered the Renaissance. Rational criticism and humanism began to rise. Philosophical background of out, but also from religion-led thinking, gradually moving towards an emphasis on human. The orientation of individual criticism, our ode to the fisherman in Erasmus, in Montaigne's essays, can be seen. Application to individuals, to question the encouragement of traditional authority following the Renaissance. The Reformation and the scientific westward journey society steps into the age of enlightenment. Its critical thinking, key historical stage of formation, and he put reason for the first time out independent thinking, established as a universal ideological virtue. During this period, such as Locke, Fort Montesquieu, thinkers such as Rousseau, Kant, they passed on religious kingship, systematic questioning of traditional ethics and knowledge. It established modern critical thinking, philosophical foundation upon which they place reason above authority. The individual should judge for himself, not blindly follow. Judge must be based on logic, experienced and open debate to test. Kant also argued in What is Enlightenment? True enlightenment, the courage to use your reason. This kind of thinking mode centered on rational criticism has gradually become the goal of modern education today. Also critical thinking, from the exercise of elite philosophers, transition to basic literacy of citizens paves the way. After the Age of Enlightenment, critical thinking begins with philosophical, gradually transition to an educational practice. Method, 19th century governorship emphasized, must be based on verifiable experience. Logical reasoning becomes the core means of testing truth. In the field of logic, Frege and others further advanced the formalization of language thinking, laid a tighter foundation. By the beginning of the 20th century, the popularization of experimental psychology and modern pedagogy, it has become the core standard of education. In the field of education, the American philosopher John Dewey once emphasized reflective thinking. He believed that education should prepare students to evaluate information, solve problems through logic. His pragmatic educational ideology, the radical foundation of current critical thinking, and his student Hu Xia also put this idea brought to China on the other side of the ocean. Although Hu Xia once made bold assumptions, be careful to verify for left and right, is also often modern Chinese experimentalism, representatives of the rationals. However, we must point out that neglect doesn't develop into true, independent and mature critical thinking concepts. In fact, China at that time, not yet critical thinking. In the Western academic context, there is a clear definition and philosophical basis, so ignore the understanding of reason and speculation. Essentially its teacher, the pragmatism of John Dewey, a simplified version in the Chinese context, who was more of a diverter and an advocate, rather than one that can. Philosophers who reconstructed the foundations of ignore the relationship to critical thinking. It's more like a voice tracker than a refiner. And here's what's even more important, the structural capabilities that should be possessed, transformed into a mild rhetorical initiative. He emphasizes the management of state employment, Western methods to study China, but never had a clear face, the incommensurability of this system of thought. Therefore, it falls into a modern path. It can be said that the contribution to critical thinking is ignored. Modernity. Lacking the skeleton of true philosophy, he opened the question, but unable to provide a solution. However, what he ignores is not his personal limitation, but the entire East Asian society. In the face of the onslaught of Western ideas, epitome of collective anxiety. This is not the person's academic judgment, it's a whole cultural community. In the face of modernity, the urgent response that had to be made, between learning from the West and preserving traditions, the introduction of methods and the surrender of values, we can see a profound game of tension. Ignore the manifestation, in times of uncertainty. Technologically rational, equity strategy as a temporary alternative to ideology. This strategy is certainly promoted the institutionalization, but it also buried a deep spiritual misreading. About the structural reasons behind this misreading, we will present the final part of this video, expand the discussion. After World War II, European and American countries from the 1950s to the 1960s in reform. Critical thinking begins to enter higher education curricula, especially in philosophy, psychology, social sciences, and other fields. In the American scholar Robert Ennis, Richard Paul, the two men have officially introduced critical thinking as a reasonable, reflective way of thinking. He decides what we should believe, or how to act as the goal, and established that critical thinking involves skills and dual structure with equal emphasis on morality. Critical thinking, completed from the philosophical tradition, transformation to modern education. They become rational citizens, indispensable basic ability. Critical thinking in the 1980s, formally entering the simultaneous education system, and gradually expanded to primary and secondary education. In basic education, critical thinking, it's been 45 years. In the rational spirit, experienced the logical foundation from the dialectical deepening of the Middle Ages, awakening to the Age of Enlightenment. We have seen critical thinking is not just a historical cognitive degree, it is a rational character that runs through the philosophical. To truly understand the thinking of creating cause belongs to itself. We also need to go back to the origin of language, evolution of word meaning and the clarification. As Wittgenstein said, the task of philosophy is to clarify form of thought. I want to trace the words. It is also a correction of misunderstandings of ideas. Therefore, next we're going to follow the path of language, ancient Greek to Latin, to modern continental languages, sort out critical sinks, the generation mechanism and cultural meaning of the word, for him in the history of, and the true face of language history. Krinovan. This is creating called sinking. One of the most basic ancient Greek roots. It means to distinguish, differential screening, judgment decision, examine in ancient Greek. He's not just making simple judgments. It involves logical reasoning, thinking skills as well as in a comprehensive analysis of philosophical rhetoric and other fields, more common in the early history of it, or in literary and artistic works. In the history, he recorded many city-state leaders' decision-making process at critical moments. Klinern appears frequently in such descriptions, and in Hirschwald's theology. We can see Zeus was at war with the Titans. Key judgments and decisions need to be made. This is used to describe the words of battle and judgment between magic. Was Klinern. Those who are familiar with the history of Western literature may know, and the Odyssey. Clayton is also often used to describe the scenes where heroes make decisions. One of the most classic applications. It appears in volume 18 of the Iliad. Dangarchius learned of the death of Patroclus. It is reported that he suffered a devastating blow. He became aware of his anger and resentment, make the war worse. It also indirectly led to the death of a good friend. Fell into an incomparable contradiction. His mother told him that if you choose revenge, you're doomed to die. Therefore, he must be present at brilliant death of a hero, and longevity but nameless. The dog makes a choice. In the context of hippoepics, Klinnon is not a sober, rational judge. It's a mixture of emotions, the heroic choice of moral destiny. Archelaus is involved in this decision, distinguishes the value of glory from longevity. Judge your own destiny and accept it. He decided to choose revenge. even if it means self-destruction. This scene speaks volumes about Kenino. The deeper meaning in ancient Greek literature. He is not just a general judgment, but a sense of one's own destiny, the final decision on moral values and the meaning of existence. This episode, embodying the heroic destiny of the Hippo epic. Archelaus is not a passive acceptance of fate. It's about being proactive, choices that are in line with one's own value, even at the cost of one's life. Let's look at the second etymology clearly calls. Kritikos, it means discriminating. In ancient Greek, kodkos, a person who has the ability to distinguish and judge. His core point is not to criticize something. It's about understanding. The ability to make a sound judgment. The word was used in ancient Greek culture, often with philosophy. Rhetoric literary criticism is closely related. For example, in Brutus Golgi, we can see, when discussing the difference between rhetorical numbers and philosophy, it is used to refer to those who, person capable of profound analysis and judgment. And in Aristotle's Poetics, Aristotle also discussed poetry and theatrical evaluation criteria. Kozo. It is also used to describe those who carry criticism with the ability to appreciate and judge. Let's look at the third word, kilodilo. Kilodilon means standard of judgment. This word is actually related to modern English, made in language, in philosophy and logic, used to denote a measure of whether something is true or false. In the context of critical thinking, he means using reasonable standards to evaluate, demonstrate facts and assumptions. In Brutus Thottide, we can see that in discussing the nature of knowledge, profitably utilize and basis used to judge truth in paper bags. In Aristotle's Walk to School, we can also see, in discussing questions of existence and essence, profitably it is used to describe a criterion used to distinguish between different modes of existence. That is to say, in ancient Greek, klitikoso and klitodilo. They come from a common verb root, klin into ancient Rome. These words evolved into Latin for clitit. During the Roman and medieval periods, clitit in Latin mainly referred to in literary criticism or a critique of the text. It's usually used as a hermeneutical term. And in Latin, in the process of evolving into a European language, we can see the French critic and German critics. The critical in English, they're synonyms. They can also be traced back to ancient Greek for city cousin, and the verb root of city cuz is kleon. In fact, they are in specific applications. Are similar. In the French literature, we can see Enlightenment thinkers of the mid-18th century, Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu. Critics in French, widely used in society, political and philosophical fields, is emphasized. Critics are not just an evaluation applied to the field of literature, it's also a method of rational analysis. And the German philosopher Kant, as early as the second half of the 18th century, criticism of pure reason, gives crits new philosophical meaning. It is no longer a simple literary or artistic judgment, but the capacity for systematic analysis of its boundaries. Criticism of pure reason is not accurate enough. We'll get back to that a little bit later. In the English context, the tomb of the British philosopher Locke Anziu, the term critical analysis has long been used to express based on experience, rational or logical analysis. Critical also began to develop during this period, judgment, or a rational analysis. In addition to that, Smith was also in the theory of economics. Start using critical, used for analytical evaluation, rather than just a negative judgment. By the early 19th century, Searle in science and the field of philosophy has been fully accepted. He stands for rational and reflective thinking proposed by John Dewey. It directly contributed to the formation of the concept. By the middle of the 20th century, CTRL thinking in philosophical became a formal term in the field of psychology. That is to say, CTRL thinking as a term concept. It was actually in the late 19th century. It was only gradually established in the mid-20th century. From a resource perspective, I think critical thinking can be thinking. There are 4 key characteristics. First, critique. Type thinking. It's the deliberate analysis of things, rather than blindly accepting certain information, even if the source of this information is rational authority. Second, critical thinking. Evaluate arguments according to reasonable standards, the validity of evidence and reasoning. Number 3, critical thinking makes rational judgments, then relying solely on emotion or accept or reject. Point 4, critical thinking. Emphasize the importance of developing good thinking habits, maintain high moral character. The most bizarre of these, the so-called reasonable standard. So what kind of standard is a reasonable standard? About this, there may be discrepancies between different textbooks. At least the following 10 criteria should be included. The first rule is logical and factual. Article 2, impartiality and objectivity. Assessment of all positions, even if these positions are consistent with one's own beliefs, interests. Rule 3, maintain courage. Courage is not afraid of authority, not afraid of the mainstream opinions of society, pressure from one group. Insist on seeking the truth, uncover the truth. Rule number 4, be humble. Staying humble can avoid arrogance. We need to admit that our knowledge is limited. We also have to admit that we can be wrong. We should be willing to accept a better argument, even if this argument double your own claims. Article 5, maintaining independence and autonomy. It's about maintaining independence of thought. We cannot accept authority lightly, or the fruits of mainstream opinion, especially when facing a complex issue. We can't rely on people's live answers. You have to rely on your own strength to explore. This is called independent thinking. Article 6, persistence. We can't let short-term losses and give up long-term thinking. There's no easy origami for any problem. Facing complex difficulties, we should also maintain the pursuit of truth. Rule 7, stay curious. Curiosity is the driving force behind inquiry, thirst for knowledge. Explore uncharted territory, rather than content with ready-made specific knowledge. Standard answers. Article 8, prudence. Before making a decision, before reaching a conclusion, we all need to ensure that our thinking and reason based on sufficient evidence, and it conforms to formal logic. Article 9, empathy. Even if both parties disagree, we should also try to understand each other's background, logic and position. We should think from the perspective of others, understand the plausibility of others' opinions, than simply starting from your own standpoint. Article 10, politics. We as thinkers, one should adhere to the inertia of logic when thinking, not because of one's own interests and position, just the facts, or apply double standards, or deliberately avoid those evidence against us. Based on the above, I believe now we can come up with a preliminary definition with consensus, critical thinking. It refers to a systematic thought process. It is based on logical reasoning and reasonable standards. Analyze the argument for information, evaluation and judgment, to reach the most rational and reasonable conclusion. It doesn't aim for blind acceptance or simple denial. It's about understanding, reasoning and making well-considered decisions. And combined with the current mainstream definition of European and American academic circles, these mainstream definitions, almost all the same. Together, they emphasize two things. Extremely critical thing. The first is the practical application of logic. The second is high moral character. So if we follow the principle of regulated translation, critical thinking should be translated as logic, application, and character. But why are we going to translate that into critical thinking? Who did this translation come from? When and where is critical thinking? What about the Chinese academic community? From what I understand, the 1980s and 1990s, critical thinking, as an important concept of thinking, gradually entered the Chinese context. At that time he was translated as critical thinking. The current translation, the earliest Chinese sources are no longer available. We take it literally. Criticism is very reminiscent of criticism and denial. In the Chinese context, there is a strong value judgments, and he can easily provoke antagonism. Obviously critical thinking. Chinese translation as critical thinking. It is impossible to accurately express, then why do we know it's wrong? It is still necessary to maintain this technique within academic standards. According to available public information, in 1881, the Japanese scholar Tetsujiro Inoue was publishing philosophy since the conference used criticism as a critical standard translation of French. This standard translation, Japanese academic literature, it lasted about 20 to 30 years. Since 1910, Kyoto School, in-depth study of the philosophical thought of Kant and Hegel. They started trying integration with Buddhism and Oriental thought. At this moment, criticism as a term in academic writing. Start with criticism. Since the 1930s, Marxist philosophy gradually entered Japan. Social criticism theory, class criticism, ideological criticism has entered the Japanese left-wing ideological circle. Word critique is given a stronger structure, revolutionary antagonistic connotation. At the same time, in sharp contrast, criticism. Criticism has now been reduced to critical evaluation of literature or art. After 1945, Japanese academia begins to promote the Frankfurt School. Critical theory became the dominant term. The word criticism gradually became critical philosophy. Critical reason, criticism of modernity. Among Japanese textbooks and translated books at that time, and to use criticism heavily as a fixed term. Clinical thinking, also translated as critical thinking in Japanese. Due to China's opposition, there is a high degree of translation path dependence. Critical thinking, following the academic habits of the Japanese academic community as critical thinking. This means that critical thinking belongs to itself. It's not what it seems. Completely neutral or universal. In fact, the word criticism it is extracted from classical Chinese and reconsidered. But after he entered the Japanese context, meaning undergoes a subtle shift. In the classical Chinese context, for example, in the qualification, the original meaning of the word criticism or censorship. It does not include modern Chinese. Criticize such negative colors. Therefore, in the academic context of the 19th century, I chose to use it makes sense to translate the term. It has the same meaning as in ancient Greek. They're essentially the same thing. But around World War II, due to the fact that Japanese society, the influence of social critical theory, use of the word critic, gradually skewed towards social criticism, negative criticism, especially in a political context. Criticism is used to describe the government. Criticism of capitalist ideology. For example, capitalism criticizes government criticism. The word criticism gradually, far from the original point. The connotation of analytical investigation, prefer to expose the problem. Blame error. This change in the connotation of words, Chinese political discourse in the 20th century, it has been further deepened. This also results in, today, negative odors in modern Chinese, even more so than in Japan. Trace this line of translation and language, and find out. Critical thinking. When introduced into the East Asian context, the first thing he experienced, linguistic rebirth, and Japan is part of this incredible concept. The setter who played a key role. In Wisdom for the New Era, Japanese scholars began to use the terminology large-scale Chinese translation. It's not a neutral translation. It's an ongoing construction with explanatory choice. This misreading is not an omission of language ability. It stems from a deeper cultural tension. Under the structure of Confucian ethics, questioning is often seen as disrespect. Judgment is often regarded as a good idea. Critical thinking is often reduced to rhetoric rather than a search for truth. Therefore, we promote critical thinking in an East Asian context. It's not just a question of translation accuracy, but for an external, to gain a deeper understanding of the problem of cultural structure. It means that we can not only use this word to really understand why is he in the native culture, became the core concept of rational citizenship education. In fact, until today, the entire East Asian society is still being the reconstruction of Western learning, because Japan is on a large scale in the new era of Mingzhuwei. The attitude of the Japanese authorities is very contradictory. Japan wants to import Western ideas and institutions. On the other hand, Japan is worried radical ideas in the West will lead to social order, unrest, and instability. This internal contradiction, many Western ideas when they entered Japan. It's been repackaged and softened. That is, Confucian ideology, some kind of cultural trial. Remove claims contrary to it. And this Japanese translation strategy directly affected the academic development of the whole Chinese cultural circle, and say it bluntly, accepted by the entire East Asian academic community. The Western philosophical system reformed by Japan. 3 critiques as an example. Kant's critic. Its core meaning is to test analytical distinction, rather than criticizing or denying. It is still inappropriate to translate it as criticism or criticism. Why did Lang translate it into criticism back then? Because of Kantian philosophy. Actually, yes. The existing knowledge system, a philosophical revolution was launched. If we want to be in translation, highlight this layer of revolution. So, the critique of pure reason translated into the revolution of the critique of practical reason translated into the revolution of practical reason, translated into judgment. Wouldn't it better reflect Kant's philosophy, cultural orientation in the history of philosophy? Japanese scholars chose to criticize during the Meiji era. Word critique, rather than a more challenging rebellion, or revolutionary. Explain that they are beneficial in weakening critical radicalism. Make it easier to be. Social acceptance in the context of Confucius. Make it even more accepted by the wise government of the day. Because of this translation hides the strangeness of when the word criticism, philosophical terms entered China. He has gone from a moment of reason to an attack. From the definition of reflection to a negative attitude. And as a result, we're learning Kant. But it was understood as loose. We're talking about theories of reason speak of emotional opposites. Not only in philosophy, in the social and political field, the reaction of the Japanese authorities was even more sensitive. Of revolution is but the Japanese translation of the word is change for new. They rarely use revolution, describe their own social change. For example, wise for new, chose to use it as a new. It's an adjusted semantics. But wisdom against heart is essentially, it's a complete politics. Social and economic revolution. The Meiji Restoration abolished the feudal system. Its authority was overthrew the shogunate. It's a change of regime. Wise Restoration abolished the samurai class. Revolutionized the social structure. Equivalent of a class revolution, the Wise Restoration introduced Western politics. Established a constitution. Complete transformation, like an institutional revolution. But the Meiji government was unwilling to admit it. Defined this change as a revolution. The reason is that the word revolution, it means completely overturning the existing order. He may encourage the underprivileged, continue with other social activities, even challenging the authority of the government at the time. Japan was still the emperor at that time, symbol of the country. If you call it a revolution, this means that the old system may be complete overthrow. How should the authority of the emperor continue? The supreme source of Japanese culture, where should it be placed? So, revolutionary translations in Japan are used for the Industrial Revolution. Japanese translation is a scientific revolution is a scientific revolution. Revolution is called political. Social revolution is called social change. The Meiji Revolution, of course, they called it the Meiji Restoration. For example, translating liberalism into liberal civil rights would translates into social reform, and Japan is in translation. It also exposes a very strong cultural individualism, really like Japanese, Western concepts. For example, Western constitutions directly translates into the Constitution. That completely changes the taste, because the Western concept of constitution refers to democracy, and what Japan calls the constitution of the empire is between the emperor, the law of supremacy. The emperor, for example, Japan, it translates to emperor, but what he called the other emperors. Still the emperor. For example, the emperor of China, Korea, including the emperors of Europe, he called an emperor. But there is only one emperor in Japan. They emphasize that their emperor is unique, is sacred. Take democracy. In the Chinese context, this translation is very appropriate. Democracy is about citizens being the masters of their own affairs, rights. But the Japanese translation is people-based. What is people-centrism? People-centrism, the people under the protection of the emperor. The so-called power also comes from the gift of the emperor. It's not the birthright of the people. So in terms of cultural attributes, citizens of Japan are still citizens, rather than citizens. This is a strong cultural individualism. Japan is culturally still seeing the world from a Japanese perspective, Rather than looking at Japan from the perspective of the world, you could say it's a kind of Japanese cultural confidence. But this cultural assertiveness is overdone. It leads to arrogance. For example, Japan used to believe that, than their neighbors. You can lead Asia yourself. For example, they are more moral than the West. And etiquette. Western societies are just technologically advanced. Poor etiquette. Including today, we can also see many Japanese tourists travel abroad. The quality shown is very high. They don't need artificial organization. You can clean the stands yourself after watching the game. This is not a way to please the outside world. Instead, the Japanese a pride in one's own culture. And this pride, it gave birth to the mentality of Japanese militarism. In fact, the Japanese translation strategy at that time, the entire East Asian he not only undermined the academic rigor that it deserved, but to the East Asian country, in the face of the wave of modernization, took a more conservative approach. As mentioned earlier, Hushi's things are not his alone. It's a problem of the entire East Asian cultural circle. This is in the face of the wave of modernity, the collective display of East Asian countries. Specific manifestations of structural anxiety. Hushi was just in the tide of ideological transfer, just one of the most iconic figures. Hushi longs for science, yearning for democracy, craving logic. He followed John Dewey. Attempt to use an empiricism, and it's pedagogical, to wake up China. However, in this approach, transplantation between cultural standards, Hushi is still the history of Chinese thought. Packaging has become the history of Chinese, from thinking about what we are missing to prove what we have. Ignore the practical and rational route pioneered. It was promoted at the institutional construction and academic subdisciplines. Rational spirit, the political courage and cultural depth it should have. He was interested in education, aware of the entitlement lie. He emphasizes the way of thinking, never delved into. These methods presuppose ethical foundation and social soil. And this is where we are today. The delays we face when we talk about critical thinking. Are we learning a reasoning skill? Or are you embracing an ethic of thought? Are we just in class training rebuttal patterns? Or are you really reflecting the whole unquestionable cultural order? Because of this, I am interested in the promotion of, not optimistic, because what critical thinking emphasizes, education systems are often associated, and values. There's a fundamental contradiction. First of all, we must make it clear that critical thinking is a product of the Western philosophical. His theory is partially legitimized by logic. And he's not just logical. It's also cultural and philosophical. Logic as a formal system, completely neutral, of course. Logical rule will be no cultural prejudice or ethnic stance. So regardless of one's national ethnicity, national belief, skin color, origin, educational background, culture, what is your ideological and political stance? Logical rules don't take sides. Logic tools are available to either side. But critical thinking is not a purely logical exercise. The other side of him is an ethic of thought. Since it is an ethics of thinking, implied a value judgment, then he has cultural opinions. He can't be completely objective and neutral. He has to have a set of preconceived values. For example, the Western emphasis is on questioning everything. Contains God, national government, family tradition, academic authority, educational institution. Everything can be questioned. But in the cultural traditions of East Asian societies build judgment based on trust. You can argue, but you cannot destroy the ethical fabric of society. For example, when a Chinese student says to a teacher, "Your argument makes no sense," this is critical thinking. In the Western classroom, this kind of behavior is certainly worth encouraging. After all, 2,400 years ago, it said that there is no love without charity. Love the truth no more. However, in Eastern culture, this behavior may be seen as a lack of respect for teachers. The logical structure is still neutral at this. However, as a student, can you use it openly? Can you correct the teacher publicly? And whether you can be accepted by society after using it. Can you be accepted by your class? That's the problem with cultural discipline. Ethics of critical thinking. And Confucian ethics. It can be said that eyes' size are incongruous. Starts with suspicion. By questioning authority. Self-reflection as a virtue. The latter is based on respect. Respect teachers with respect. Teach with caution. Both are on the basic value goal. It's the opposite. The former seeks the name of truth. The latter is the kiss of order. In the age of agricultural civilization, stability may have a basis for survival. But in today's technological society, especially in economic activities, reliance on cutting-edge science, in the context of innovation in chemistry, this cultural tension has gone from a latent state, entered a state of constant confrontation. Cultural troubles caused by Japan's smart rest still in my ears. This country used to grow at an amazing rate. From the transformation from feudal system to modern state, political system, rule of law system, education model, the academic system is almost entirely westernized, and thus in East Asia, take the lead, the ranks of the so-called modern civilized. However, at this level, the system of appearance, under the system of mind, those who are rooted in the depths of history, ethical structure and authoritative beliefs, really been completely liquidated. Ask Japan today. It describes itself as modern openness. A liberal democracy governed by the rule of law. Can its citizens really openly question the existence of the emperor itself? Everything seems rationally open. In institutionalized public spaces, still regarded as a symbol of the within untouchable sanctity. Criticize the emperor. Is it difficult to gain legitimacy in public, and in a political context, it was seen as heretical. This unquestionable center, it's still intrinsically sacred. The residual structure of authority, generation of public reason constitutes core internal barriers. This shows that, even if a country, the current transformation has been completed at the institutional level, has authority and criticizable, deep value of relationships overlie, then the so-called critical thinking can only stay on the formal surface. He is denied access to the core areas of culture and morality. East disease alone. But when the countries of East Asia faced modernity, common ideological dilemma, because of this, promoting critical thinking in East Asian society is not a purely technical issue. Translation problem. It's not just an internal problem of the academic system. He touched upon was a deep conflict of values. It's an ethical mobilization of the mind. Is it just a few imported Western textbooks? Open the door to a course in thinking about change writing. Cultivate a generation of critical thinkers. Because before critical thinking happened, we have to answer a more fundamental question. Do we allow a man to challenge his teacher? Do we allow a person to question his parents? Overthrow his former club? Are we willing to express a different opinion? Morally unreasonable. Transform into a behavior worthy of encouragement. Because of this, promotion of critical thinking in East Asia, it's ultimately a moral issue. Ethical issues, public opinion issue. It could even be said to be a question of political philosophy. He demanded that the entire East Asian society be. What is a legitimate expression? What is a reasonable objection? What is an individual? The true responsibility of the community. Otherwise, the so-called cultivation of critical thinking ability rates into formalist, even those who have undergone systematic training. Logically correct, sharp speech. But they never dared. Pointing to authentic rights and social traditions. Follow me and take you to see philosophy in general. See you next time.